Welcome to the Virginia Carolina Deer Tracts podcast. I'm Mike Davis.
And I'm Sean Mills.
And we're here to talk about everything real estate
and the great outdoors
in both Virginia
and North Carolina.
Thanks for tuning in. All right, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Virginia Carolina Deer Tracts podcast. We are very pleased today to have a special guest with us, Alexandra Lombard from the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. Did I get that right?
Yep, you got it.
Okay, excellent. So Alexandra is here to talk with us a little bit today about what's going on with some of the different wildlife species here in the state of Virginia. And as we get into that, Alexandra, why don't you just get us started here, telling us who you are, what your position is with the DWR, and what you do.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. So I am the Wildlife Health Coordinator with Virginia DWR, and basically I manage our chronic wasting disease program, but then I'm also involved with a lot of other wildlife health issues that come up and work really closely with our wildlife veterinarian, John Tracy. But I've been working here for a little over 2.5 years now, and previously I worked for Ohio's Division of Wildlife.
Oh, wow. Okay. Awesome. Well, CWD is certainly seems to be a hot topic, not just in Virginia, but all across the nation. My social media, all the deer hunting pages, the podcasts I listen to, it just seems to be there every day. People are talking about it. And, as you and I discussed, just kind of informally before we started here, opinions seem to be all over the place on this topic. But obviously with your background, you have extensive knowledge of what the disease is, what's going on. So for those listeners of ours, I guess that are not familiar with CWD, I guess we can start in its most basic form. If you can give me a quick rundown, layman's terms of how you would define this disease.
Yeah, definitely. So chronic wasting disease is a disease that is always fatal, and it affects deer species, and it affects their nervous system. So typically what we associate with chronic wasting disease when deer reach the end stage of illness is deer that are really thin and acting weird because basically they're losing their brain function.
It attacks the brain tissue, is that correct?
Yes, it does. It ends up leaving essentially holes in the brain, which is why they start losing the ability to act like normal deer.
I think that describes some of the human species we have running around.
Yeah, could be.
Sorry, couldn't help myself. But yeah, now when you say, that the deer are behaving weird, give me some examples of what you've seen.
Yeah, so some examples. I want to clarify this too. So it's not common at this point in Virginia to see a deer that reaches this late stage of illness, because they can be infected for 1.5 to 2 years before they actually start to look sick. But once they do, some of the behaviors that we see are just kind of a lack of awareness. So they might not be afraid of people. They might be approaching people's homes or people directly and just not be really scared by them. They might be kind of drooping their head, drooling, having a hard time just moving around, and just seeming very out of it, basically.
Now, I know that a lot of people, and I'm going to include myself in this, before I really started, digging into some of the literature, it's very easy to get this confused with EHD.
Yeah.
And there are some differences. It's not the same disease, correct?
Correct. Yeah. EHD, so epizootic hemorrhagic disease. It's really 2 viral diseases that we see in deer seasonally. And so those are spread by a fly, basically, as opposed to chronic wasting disease, which is caused by a prion, which is a protein. And so EHD, it'll kind of come through and it might wipe out a lot of deer locally over a short period of time. And so when we see deer that have hemorrhagic disease, typically they'll die kind of rapidly, I guess. So we won't see this kind of prolonged period of decline where they get super skinny and start acting strange. Instead, they might start developing those similar neurological symptoms, but be in pretty good body condition. And then a lot of times we'll find them dead near water sources because they just develop a really high fever. And so they seek out that water to cool down. And so, for example, this past year we had an outbreak, and the year before, I guess, in the Shenandoah Valley. And, some landowners report seeing 10 plus dead deer on their property. And it's definitely not something that we want to see, but it is something that the local populations, while they might decline for a few years because of that, they will usually bounce back after that period of time.
Okay.
Whereas chronic wasting disease, we have not seen that.
The flies that you're speaking of, the midge, is that what it is?
Yeah, yeah,
Does that do they not play a part in CWD? Is it only
correct.
UHD? Okay,
Yeah, they only play a part in EHD, and deer can't spread hemorrhagic disease to each other either.
I
It's
got you.
just from that fly biting the deer and then transmitting the virus.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, let's talk about CWD in the state of Virginia.
Yeah,
What are you seeing statewide? I'm located, kind of in South Side Virginia, kind of centrally located, and uh, to my knowledge, we haven't had anything, in this area, which is, probably why I just don't know much about, it's, closing my eyes and hoping the boogeyman ain't there, but I feel like
right.
it's just kind of creeping in. What are you seeing
Yeah,
out there?
I know. I'm keeping my fingers crossed it doesn't make its way to you. But so right now, we basically have chronic wasting disease in two areas of Virginia. So up in the northern part of Virginia, and I'm saying Northern Virginia, I'm not necessarily referring to Nova specifically, but Frederick County, which borders West Virginia, that's where CWD was first detected, and that's where we have the most cases. But then trickling down to Shenandoah County and then eastward across all the way to Fairfax County. So that's where we have one pocket of chronic wasting disease. And then down in Southwest Virginia in 2020, CWD was detected in Montgomery County, so near Blacksburg area, kind of. And so we have a pocket down there that's like Montgomery, Floyd, Pulaski. And then, kind of more notably, this past season, we had a detection in Tazewell County, which is even farther southwest. And that's bordering West Virginia as well. And so those are really the areas where we currently have found chronic wasting disease, and we do test across the state. So that's where we know it is right now.
So in the Southwest area, I know the state has gone to great lengths to reintroduce the elk population.
Yeah,
How is this affecting the elk?
right. That's a good question. So far, it hasn't affected the elk in that we have not detected chronic wasting disease in any elk within Virginia. This disease can infect elk, and so it is definitely a concern for us because Tazewell County is so close to our elk management zone. So just one county over is our elk management zone and where we have the majority of the elk. And so it's definitely introduced some new concerns, I guess, for us with that positive detection down there that we are hoping to address in our next iteration of our CWD management plan. But really, our goal is to prevent the introduction into the elk herd as much as we possibly can.
Do you have a way, and I don't know if you do or not, this is kind of an off the cuff question,
Mhm.
but in what you're seeing year in and year out from your testing, are you seeing a rate of growth or a rate of expansion? And if you are they is it kind of is it kind of normalized? Are you seeing something that, hey, this is an alarming rate, or, hey, we can see that the methods that we're putting in place is really slowing this down, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't have any, I guess, like specific numbers or anything to put to it, but I can say that we've had more positive detections over the past few years, year to year. However, we haven't seen, I guess, that much of an increase in prevalence of the disease in counties where it's already existed. So, like, disease management area 2, which is basically Loudoun County down to Orange County up in the northern part of Virginia. We have quite a few counties up there that have had detections, but they just have a couple every single year. And it doesn't really seem to be increasing in prevalence at any kind of like quick pace that we are able to detect right now. Frederick County is really the main county where we each year we get more and more positive cases, and that prevalence tends to go up. But even down in Southwest Virginia, it's stayed at, just a few detections every single year. And so while CWD is spreading, it is spreading in Virginia, it seems to be happening at a fairly slow rate, especially geographically, minus these like kind of big jumps that we've seen over the years.
Yeah, that's interesting. That, I think you mentioned that the CWD, can kind of reside in the animal for a year or two, or possibly even longer, maybe, before the effects really start taking a hold. So that's kind of an interesting that I say virus. I don't know if it's classified as a virus, but it's interesting that it would almost kind of be dormant for a period of time like that before kicking in.
Yeah. And I think that is one thing that probably surprises the most people that I talk to anyway, just because, I call pretty much everyone who has a positive deer, and almost all of the positive deer that we test are hunter harvested deer. They looked super healthy. A lot of these are big bucks that, people got, and they wouldn't suspect anything just by looking at them. And yeah, CWD is really tricky because it's caused by this protein. Um, it's just there's so many factors that make it a very challenging disease to work with. And yeah, one is that it just takes so long um, to incubate basically in the deer before it actually has any kind of visible effect on them. But that whole time they're infected and they don't look sick, they are still shedding the prion pretty much. And so they can be infecting other deer during that time.
And what are the various ways that they share that prion with other deer? Uh,
Yeah, so they can share it from deer to deer, so directly through contact, whether they're mating, grooming each other, fighting even, things like that. But they can also pass it indirectly through their body fluids. And so that just means that if they urinate in an area, the prions can be found there. And then if another deer comes through and is grazing in that same spot, they can pick up the prions that way. And one of the other reasons that CWD is such a challenge is because when a deer does, urinate or anything in an area, leave prions on the environment, those prions can stay in the soil, they can get uptaken by plants and still be infectious up to like years later potentially. And
I heard
so,
on it was one podcast I was listening to where they actually claimed that the prions were in the soil forever. But that's the only place I heard that. Most just kind of say years.
yeah,
Do
I
you
don't think
know an
there's like
exact timeline?
Yeah, I don't think there's really a clear agreement on how long they can remain infectious, and I think that it's dependent on things like soil type or in other environmental factors. Maybe I don't know if temperature might play a role or something like that, but they can basically stay out there and another deer could come and get infected for a really, really long time.
One of one of the other things that I heard they were talking about, just talking about the prions, they were talking about like, farmers that cut hay, that kind of thing,
Hmm.
that the prions are in the hay. And so if they cut the hay on a farm and, take the hay bale somewhere else, that they could in fact be transferring those prions. Um, it's just one of the ways that I guess the disease could be spread. Is
Yeah,
that true?
it is possible. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible for plants to basically take these prions up into their leaves, into all the different parts of them, pretty much. And so it is certainly possible that um, hay could become infected if infected deer are kind of going through a field or something like that, and then get moved somewhere else. And what we don't understand is the how big of a role all of these different methods are playing in the spread. Um, because scavengers too potentially could be leading to some prion spread. We do think right now that the transportation of deer, live deer, and or deer carcasses is probably one of the biggest like unnatural factors, I guess, other than like deer to deer contact that are leading to spread of the disease.
Yeah. Um, one of the things that I know the DWR has been doing, they've actually been doing it for years. They have the regulation in place about all the natural, deer urine and things like that are used as attractants during hunting season.
Right,
And the argument on the street, has always been, well, I mean, these these samples or whatever are taken from fenced in deer herds, so
right.
the assumption is that those herds are completely healthy and fine, so how would that be a bad thing? But I've actually read that those environments are, they have CWD as well. So
Yeah. And while there are some diagnostic tests that can be used to test deer while they're alive now, they're not as good. Basically, they're not necessarily as accurate as the tests that we use to test deer once they're dead. And so things might slip by in those cases.
and at this point there is no known cure for this disease. Is that correct?
Correct. And it's the same for all prion diseases. There's a few others like mad cow disease is a prion disease too. No cure for any of them.
So I'm assuming that somewhere behind the scenes, some very smart people are actually working towards that. I'm not sure if you have any knowledge of that or what kind of progress has been made or anything like that.
Yeah, I know that there's a few groups that are working on developing a vaccine for chronic wasting disease, although it's definitely not, necessarily anywhere close to being able to be used, but I know that that's something that would at this point in time likely be mostly valuable for farmed deer as opposed to, our wild herds of deer.
Yeah. So I guess with that being in mind, then our only, your only real step or everybody's only real step is to work on methods of prevention uh,
Yeah.
at this
Mhm.
time. So let's just kind of talk through some of those recommended methods of prevention that's on the website there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, our main goal really is to prevent the spread and slow the spread as much as we possibly can. And so for us as an agency, that means just trying to minimize movement of deer. And obviously, there's nothing that we can do to deer in the wild. We can't tell a deer, like, do not cross this county border or anything like that. But we do have a few tools that we use here in Virginia. And so one of the biggest ones is our carcass transportation regulations. And so basically, if you are hunting in a disease management area, which is an area of counties surrounding a positive detection, and we have all this information, like the counties are laid out on our website if you want to see a map of all of these. But basically, if you harvest a deer from a disease management area. You cannot take the whole carcass out of the disease management area into another part of the state. You can break it down, so you could quarter it or debone it or take like finished taxidermy products out or something like that. But mainly we're just trying to prevent the high risk parts. And so by that, I mean the brain and the spinal cord, areas where this disease accumulates the most. We're trying to prevent those from being moved around, and then which would potentially introduce CWD into new areas of the state. So if you can imagine someone harvests a deer in Frederick County, where there's a very high likelihood of harvesting a CWD positive deer, you take that deer carcass home to, let's say, Augusta County, which is where I am, and you process it at home and you dispose of the extra carcass parts, maybe in a compost pile or something in your backyard. Now you have infected matter, basically, an infected carcass. And those prions can then leach into the environment. And as we know, if any other deer come by, they can pick it up. And that's how it can be introduced into a new area. So that's kind of the biggest thing that we have right now, as far as preventing spread as much as we can. But
So let me focus on that just for a second from the hunting perspective.
yeah, definitely.
In the scenario you just described.
Hmm.
So a harvested deer in Frederick County, you know, do all the meat and stuff. But like you said, I'm traveling home to Augusta County. So what is the protocol there? What is it that specific hunter is supposed to do at the time that he harvests that deer? Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, he's not supposed to take that meat at all. I guess he or she should probably know that before they hunt, I guess. Um, but is that the rule that that meat needs to stay in Frederick County until it's tested, or how does that work?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the meat can leave. The meat is totally fine to leave. So basically, if you are going to process the deer yourself at home, what I would recommend doing and what you would really what would be the best thing to do legally is you harvest that deer, you quarter it there in the field, and then you can take all those quarters home with you and either bury the rest of that carcass or just leave it on site. Or if you want to take it to the landfill, you could do that too. We have, I think in Clark County, we have a couple dumpsters that are DWR like sponsored dumpsters for
I
people
got
to
you.
dispose of carcass parts. And I think that's something we want to expand in the future. But you would quarter it there in the field. You can take those quarters home and then process it however you want. The trickier parts come when people want to take their deer to a processor or a taxidermist that's not in the disease management area. And
Yeah.
so for example, if you did harvest a deer in Frederick County and you had a processor in Augusta County, which is not in the disease management area that you wanted to go to, you'd have to quarter it there, in the field in Frederick County before you could take it back to that processor. Otherwise, you would potentially need to find a processor that's in the disease management area. So that's an option. If someone wanted to mount the deer, then they would either need to cape it themselves, which I know a lot of taxidermists would not recommend. Um, it is a time-consuming and skillful thing to do. They would either have to cape it themselves and skull cap it and take it to their taxidermist that's outside of the disease management area, or again, potentially find a taxidermist within the disease management area. But I know people are loyal to their taxidermists and for good reason. So it's hard. And it's something that you can always work with your taxidermist on too, depending on where they are. I mean, I know some who are located really close to a border that are willing to travel to cape it out at the border. Not everyone by any means. And it's so dependent on everyone's business. but that's probably one of the most challenging aspects of our carcass transport regulations. Um, and then if you were planning on doing a European mount at home, then there's not really a great option for you because unfortunately you'd have to get that skull to the point where there's no brain matter in it before it left the
before
disease
transferring
management
it.
area.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that would be incredibly difficult.
right. So unless you have a buddy who, is willing to let you come by and do it there, or you're willing to camp out for a little while and set up your own stove or something like
Yeah,
that, then
yeah.
that is definitely more of a challenge to
Now,
work
what
around.
about human meat consumption? Last I read, I think there was really no evidence that I guess any of this transfers to humans. So in going back to that same scenario, uh, is the meat consumption okay? Do they need to wait for test results? What do y'all recommend for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, right now, as far as we know, you're correct in that we don't have any evidence that humans can become infected from eating positive meat. However, there's kind of a gray area where we also can't say with 100% certainty that it's not possible at all. And my understanding from, researchers who are looking at this is that there's a concern that right now, maybe humans can't get it, but CWD might change. We already have a few strains of CWD that exist. And so maybe a future strain could cross that barrier and infect people. And so, because it's a disease that's very similar to mad cow disease, which did infect a couple hundred people, um, out of an abundance of caution, organization like human health organizations like CDC recommend that if you know meat is positive, that you don't eat it. At the end of the day, we leave it up to the hunter. We don't confiscate positive meat or anything like that. But I definitely let everyone know that that's what the best available science we have is, and the recommendation from organizations like that are that you don't eat it, and that yeah, if you're getting it tested from an area where there's CWD, that you wait until you have that result until you eat it.
Now, does the DWR, do they handle the testing?
Yep, we handle all of the testing. And we also will notify hunters of their results. If they're positive, I will call them directly. Otherwise, we have an online portal where they can just check their results, and so they all get uploaded there.
How long does the testing process usually take?
Usually, so for deer that are tested that are in our disease management areas, we pick deer up on a weekly basis. So we have quite a few technicians that will drive routes every single week to fridges where people can drop deer heads off at, processors and taxidermists that we work with, and we will send them out on a weekly basis for testing. And usually it takes 1 to 3 weeks, depending on the time of the season, to get a result back. So earlier on, like October, it'll be on that quicker turnaround time, but
Yeah.
later in November, it's going to probably be a little longer.
Guess it's just very
Um,
volume dependent.
yeah, it is very volume dependent. And then we have a few freezers set up across the rest of Virginia at some of our regional offices. And those ones are going to take a lot longer just because they aren't trafficked as much, and then they're also not getting picked up as frequently necessarily. They're getting sampled, but then not, actually sent to a lab. And so those ones will take longer. And then kind of similarly, we have taxidermists that we work with across Virginia that are not in our disease management area counties. So like on the Eastern Shore, for example, we have some taxidermists that we work with to get samples from there. And those ones, we don't actually get those samples until the end of the season. And so it won't be until March, usually, that we have those results back.
Okay. Man,
But at least,
that's
yeah,
a
I
lot
mean,
of
at
stuff.
least, yeah, I know it is a lot. Yeah, at least the people that are harvesting deer where we know CWD is, they're going to get their results back much faster.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I think one of the things that I'm hoping this podcast will do to the average listener is just kind of educate people on what it really is, what's really going on. Just because, like I mentioned earlier, there's just so much information out there that is just being offered as fact. And,
Right.
and it may be fact, it may not be. I don't know. It can't all be true because there's just,
Right.
so much conflicting information. But the reality is that it's here.
Hmm.
And, if we're not very careful, all of us that are very passionate about deer hunting are going to have a real problem.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the whole reason why we spend so much energy and time and resources, figuring out where CWD is and how to manage it, because ultimately we want to protect the longevity of the deer herds we have here. And CWD unfortunately threatens that, whether it means that deer herds are going to collapse entirely or lead to just smaller herds with a much younger age structure. It's going to affect the deer, it's going to affect hunting, it's going to affect, certain people's livelihoods and, um, where tons of people get food. So it has the potential to cause some pretty drastic effects. And we've started to see that out in Western states where CWD has been around a lot longer. We haven't yet seen those kinds of declines here in Virginia, and it's kind of just a matter of time.
I know that one of the things that I hear in all this online stuff is, they talk about how the disease is there, but there's not very many recorded actual deaths of deer from the disease. What
Hmm.
are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's true in Virginia specifically, I should say. The majority of the deer we test are hunter harvested. So hunters are the reason that they
Yeah.
are killed, and that they've died. But we do respond to reports that we get of potential clinically ill deer, so deer that
Yeah.
look sick. And the majority of those are in Frederick County and Shenandoah County right now. And so it is true. We definitely have only tested a handful of deer that died and were confirmed to have chronic wasting disease, and that's been attributed to it. We haven't done any kind of widespread studies to see, what percentage of the population up there is dying because of CWD. But I will say, in neighboring um, West Virginia, so just across the Frederick County border, where they first detected CWD 5 years before us, or 4 years before us, I should say, they have been working on a mortality study, and they've been collaring a bunch of deer, and chronic wasting disease is the leading cause of mortality in their deer
Oh, wow.
in that county in particular. More than hunter harvest, more than deer vehicle collisions. And so we don't think we're at that point. It does not seem like we're at that point at all yet up in Frederick County, but it is a possibility in our future that that can be the case. So yes, you're right. Unless you're up in Frederick County, then you probably aren't seeing deer die as a result of chronic wasting disease in Virginia yet.
Well, and it doesn't sound like it's the kind of thing, with EHD, you'd hear the nightmare stories of the farmer that went to check out his pond and there was 50 deer, in the pond dead.
Right,
The CWD doesn't affect them the same way, like that because of the fever and
right.
all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they have just such a prolonged time. I mean, they're probably declining once they start to actually lose their brain function. They probably die in about 4 months or so. And so during that time, they might go die somewhere that's a little less conspicuous. And so they're not going to be in places where you'd necessarily see them too.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, an average person that walks up on a dead carcass is going to think any number of reasons and probably not going to go to the trouble of notifying anyone and trying to get testing done, that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, usually we'll get reports if someone saw the deer on their property. They saw that it didn't look great, and then a couple of days later they found a dead deer that looked to be the same deer. So that's kind of when we'll get a report about that. And we've also we will dispatch deer as an agency that look really sick and are not doing well, and we'll test the ones that look like they might have chronic wasting disease. And so even though they didn't die as a result of CWD yet, they would have gotten there pretty soon. So we've had some of those as well. But
Okay.
one thing that I thought is kind of interesting, just from listening to some presentations recently from research out of Pennsylvania, is that deer with CWD made up a large portion of their deer that died from getting hit by a car, and also some deer that died from a predator or something like that too. And so it might having chronic wasting disease might predispose them to die from one of those methods a little more easily too.
Sure. Yeah. I think, you mentioned earlier if they start acting abnormally, then, they're more likely to step out in front of a vehicle or be
Right.
easier target for predators. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, let me ask you, I guess, one last question here. And we talked about this a little bit before, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. The state of Oklahoma, if I'm understanding correctly, recently passed some legislation. I believe it was called the Genetic Improvement Act.
Hmm.
And I believe the basis for what they were doing, I guess, just to step back, I guess goats deal with a very similar disease. I think it's called scapie or scrapie or something like
Scrapey.
that.
Yep. Yeah. Scrapey.
And I guess one of the ways that they have battled that was, I guess, through some, I'll say, genetic engineering, where they were able to, I guess, figure out certain genetics that fought the disease better, and basically used breeding and this kind of stuff to introduce, I guess, the I'll say stronger animals into the herd,
Hmm.
and they seem to have some positive results from that. So it looks like they're trying to take the same approach through deer breeding, and there seems to be a lot of I don't know if it's controversy or certainly mixed opinions about that. Kip Adams, who very with the National Deer Association, came out very openly spoke against this idea.
Yeah.
But as a person in your position, I'm sure you've heard all kinds of ideas. What are your thoughts, or what are your department's thoughts on this kind of thing?
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, my understanding of what's happening in Oklahoma is that they are taking this idea of a CWD resistant deer, which I put in quotations, and basically, um, there are some deer who, based on their genetics, they can still get CWD, but they may have a longer incubation period. So they may get infected and then not die for 5 years as opposed to 2 years. And they may shed fewer prions during that time as well. But they still can get infected and they still will die if they do get it. So Oklahoma, which is a state that has a really large captive deer industry, deer farming industry. They have this legislation where they're basically trying to assess the current genetic pool of their wild deer, and then with the goal of breeding deer that are these more resistant, have these more resistant genes, and then releasing those into the wild and hopefully kind of speeding along an evolutionary process to make deer better able to withstand chronic wasting disease. And yes, it is very controversial because anytime you're talking about releasing a captive bred animal into the wild, you will hear a whole lot of different opinions,
Yeah.
especially from disease people, because we're concerned about the implications there. And so, yeah, when it comes to that, Virginia we do not really have much of a captive cervid industry at this point. We banned the farming of deer a while ago, and now we just have a few captive cervid facilities that are more like zoo or research facilities in the state. Um, but the movement of live deer is one of the greatest risk factors and easiest ways to spread CWD. So, that's something that we do not hope to pursue at some point.
Yeah.
Um, but it's also kind of like I said earlier, there is a risk that you take when it comes to moving live deer, especially into the wild, just because our diagnostic testing at this point is not necessarily as accurate on live animals as it is on dead animals. And so if you happen to have something slip by, suddenly you now have CWD introduced into potentially a new part of the population. But yeah, it's definitely interesting legislation. I believe Indiana is also possibly on a similar path right now. So we'll see how things go.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, um, you know, um, I'd like to think that, all the states are collaborating and working together and, hopefully whatever it is, 5, 10 years that either some kind of vaccine or some kind of cure or some way to treat the prions, whether it's in the soil or whatever, will come about to make this a thing of the past and a thing of very little concern. But Alexandra, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your day to spend with us and help talk about this stuff. Again, it was just important to me, as a Virginian, to get the facts on, what this really is and how we can deal with it as a state, as fellow hunters. I'd rather see everybody kind of paddling in the same direction than all of this opposite ends of the spectrum, arguing amongst themselves. But man, that was a very, very informative discussion. I really appreciate you being on here, and hopefully we can get you on here again today, another day, and maybe we can talk about that bird flu or talk about, maybe we'll have some positive updates to talk about on the CWD stuff at another time. But thanks so much for
Yeah,
spending
yeah.
time with us today.
I really appreciate you having me here. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about chronic wasting disease, unfortunately,
Yeah.
anytime.
Yeah,
But
I'm sorry that that's your topic of expertise, but
yeah, I know I'm never the bearer of good news usually.
no,
It's
no,
always bad
no.
news.
I hope we
But
can put you out of a job,
yeah,
unfortunately.
I honestly I would love that. I would
Yeah.
love that.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks again for everything, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.